FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
Firstly, these were coordinated attacks in the sense that there was very clearly some command and control being exerted by some leadership over the attacks. These weren't just terrorists that in essence were wound up and deployed to their target sites, but rather throughout the attacks we now have ample evidence from the use of cell phones, not only the cell phones that the attackers themselves brought, but also the cell phones that they took from some of their hostages and indeed some of their tragic victims, that they were communicating with commanders or controllers elsewhere. The evidence tends to point that they were communicating with them in Pakistan, in fact, and that these were senior commanders in the LET. But this is the point I want to emphasize, is that this was more like a military operation than a terrorist attack. The stereotypical terrorist attack, bomb explodes, someone shot and killed, it's over, in essence. The bodies are taken away, the injured are moved to a hospital, the shattered glass and broken masonry is swept away, we go back to normal. This was a terrorist incident that was deliberately coordinated and directed so that it would be sustained, so that it would not only get into the news on that Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, as you'll recall, but would sit in the news for nearly 72 hours later. That in and of itself is quite unique. We haven't seen a terrorist incident like that in some time. I mean, it harkens back to the hostage-taking incidents or airline hijackings of the 1970s, for example, in the 1980s. But here, too, there was an absolutely key difference. In those former, let's say, extended or extenuated terrorist incidents, the purpose of seizing the hostages was to use them to negotiate or to barter with, to gain some political concessions. In this case, the seizure of hostages, at least in my view, was for the purpose of pure cold-blooded murder. It was designed to get hostages, to keep them in one place, and eventually, when the order or command was given from elsewhere, or when the attackers themselves were surrounded, then to execute the hostages. But you can see the fact that this incident stayed in the news for so long has had this overwhelming global impact. I mean, this was news not only throughout the duration of the 3 days while the operation was going on, but it's remained news to this day. And that's, I think, something that the terrorists seized upon and very successfully exploited, and that others are likely to do so as well. And then finally, it was also simultaneous. That's not that rare with what I would call jihadi terrorists. I mean, terrorists that conform to the broad motives and objectives of al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadis. For them, in fact, simultaneity is their key metric of success. We can debate in Washington what the metric of success in the war on terrorism is. At least from this adversary's perspective, it's very clear. Their metric is being able to do more than one thing at one time. But generally in the past, that number often, not always, was conformed to the number 4. 4 planes were hijacked on 9/11. It was intended to bomb 4 subway cars in London in 2005. They bombed 3 in a bus. There were 4 suicide bombings in Istanbul, for example. 4 figures, because at least in Islamic numerology, 4 is the figure that represents justice and retribution. This was more than double that. There were 10 attacks. So they weren't only simultaneous, but there were far more attacks. And the number 10 in Islamic numerology is basically the symbol of the universe. I'm not sure that it has as much to do with it.